I've always felt that a superior talent acquisition function could take a mediocre company and transform them into a high performing company in about a 5-year span, just by controlling the quality of the talent that comes in. It's my opinion that within the next couple of years, applicant processors will be replaced by AI. Negotiation is not a high stakes game of chicken. It is not a win-lose scenario. A good pay negotiation should be a collaboration. So the promise that I make to my clients is that you can maximize your offer while keeping the risk of losing the offer to almost zero. And my job is to get you to take the first offer. That's what I get paid to do. And so I'm kind of like the prosecutor who has now become the defense attorney in the conversation.
We're diving into the world of recruitment transformation with an absolute industry heavyweight in John Gates. John is the founder of Recruiting Transformations LLC, a former head of global recruiting for multiple 200 companies, and has been revolutionizing talent acquisition for over 2 decades. He's also the founder of Salary Coach, a platform where he coaches executives and professionals on salary negotiation. And if that's not enough, he's also the author of the best-selling book, Act Your Wage, on salary negotiation strategies. So we're going to mine that experience to get John's views on modern recruitment strategies and his thoughts on the latest job search trends. We will get some insider tips on standing out in today's competitive job market and reveal strategies that have helped his clients secure significant pay increases. This one's going to be fascinating, and I'm sure packed with actionable insights for you to take home. So let's get started. John, welcome to the podcast. How are you today?
Thanks so much. I appreciate being here. I'm great and excited to be part of your podcast today. So thanks for inviting me.
Excited to have you on. And look, let's, after that introduction, I'm sure everybody that is listening cannot wait to get into it. So let's get started with the first question that we ask every single guest. What are your experiences of hiring and being hired? And do you have any lessons learned?
Oh, that could hog up the whole time we have together. So I'll try to cut it short. I've been a recruiter for 30 years now. So I started recruiting in 1990. And that was before the internet was a thing, before email was around, before applicant tracking systems. So when I first started, I worked for an agency, and I had a filing cabinet filled with resumes that had been mailed in. Like email wasn't around yet, right? So people had to mail stuff in. You ran ads in newspapers or trade publications or things like that. People would mail their resume in or hand carry it in. And so it sat in a filing cabinet organized roughly by category. So I had an engineer's file that was about that thick, full of resumes that I'd received last week to 2 years ago or something like that. And so anytime I got an engineering position open, I would go to that file and I would start to dig through it. And of course, I never found what I was looking for. So I had to pick up the phone and call the mechanical engineer and asked if he knew any electrical engineers or any test engineers or something like that. And so I learned at an early age how to build a network on the fly and how to do that sort of thing as a recruiter. After 5 years in agencies, I moved into the corporate recruiting world and rose up into leadership pretty quickly. Before long, I was the head of recruiting in multiple Fortune 500 companies. And every time I got hired as a recruiting leader, it was always to fix the broken stuff. And if you're a job seeker today and you've been looking around at any bit at all, you know that most of the stuff in recruiting is still broken. After all these years, it's really, there's a lot of stuff that needs to be fixed. I think a lot has changed over the last couple of years. The emergence of AI is causing issues for corporate recruiters today. The applicant volumes are very, very high for a couple of different reasons. And that makes competing for a job even harder than it was. People remember back to the Great Resignation, which was just a few years ago when multiple offers were easy to get. Now it's hard to get an interview. So it flips just like the housing market from buyer's market to seller's market. And right now we are in a talent buyer's market. So I've been on the job hunt myself many, many times. As a recruiting guy, I've been laid off 4 different times in my career. So I know what that feels like. I know what it's like to be in between, to have your whole family depending upon you getting something and getting it fast, to be worried about homelessness or car payments or things like this. And when you work in the recruiting specialty area, you're kind of out on the skinny branches of the organization. When the company's growing, you're the most important person in the whole company because you're adding the staff, right, to hit the revenue targets, to hit the growth. But as soon as the company decides it's time to get smaller, that's when it becomes a dangerous place to be professionally. Um, HR would often go to departments with a headcount challenge and say, guys, we got to reduce 10%, 15, 20% of the headcount because those salary payroll is our biggest expenses. And people in operations or in IT or in other functions would say, well, before I do that, how about those people over there in recruiting? Why are we still recruiting if you're asking me to cut headcount? So throughout the years, I've had to reduce talent that I hired in recruiting departments. That's really painful to do. And I've lost my own position several times. So I understand what it's like to be on the outside. But most of my time I spend pitching offers, negotiating on behalf of companies, and now with Salary Coach, I'm bringing that expertise to the other side of the negotiating table, helping people, real people, you and me, like to negotiate with people like me, and get the most out of that next offer package. It's pretty cool. I love doing that.
Amazing, amazing. Well, we'll get into the salary coach side of things in a little bit, but there is so much to unpack there, John, that
Mm-hmm.
we're not going to probably have time to touch on all of it. But I think one of the things I did want to kind of get your thoughts on, and it's a bit of a theme throughout that entire answer, was around there's always been issues in talent acquisition in recruitment,
Mm-hmm.
and
Yeah.
you've gone in and tried to fix those issues every single time you've gone in, or you've been brought in to fix those issues. What are the differences? Are there differences between the issues that you're having to fix at the beginning of your career and when you were first going into those companies to the latter stage of your career within those Fortune 200-300 companies? Were they broadly the same? Were they different? Like how did those issues change as the workforce has changed? And we won't touch on AI yet. Again, that's a massive topic that we'll tackle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that the problems have always been similar.
Hmm.
The tactics are a little different, the tools are a little different, the response to the problems has changed over time. But a common example is it takes a company too long to hire somebody, and that's a problem that exists in most companies today. So if you're like most of the time when I get hauled in to fix something, that's the number one most common problem I get asked to fix is why does it take us so long to hire somebody? Another issue is we have a turnover problem, which usually means they're hiring the wrong people. So a quality of hire problem is another common problem. And the last perennial problem is why does it cost so much? Um, and so often, corporate recruiting functions become very dependent upon recruiting agencies and staffing agencies. It's not uncommon to go into a Fortune 500 company and find a $10 million search fee bill, buried in the recruiting budget somewhere.
Hmm.
And so often you can adjust that dependency. You have to upskill the people that are doing the work. You have to bring in maybe a few new vendors or something like that. But you can recoup most of that money and then invest it in your recruiting function to make things faster, to improve quality of hire, and do all that sort of thing. And I've also discovered throughout the years that there are a couple of different kinds of corporate recruiters in the world. There are applicant processors, and then there are hunters.
Yeah.
And so, if you have a typical corporate recruiter is going to have a portfolio of positions that they're working on. Sometimes it's 20 or 30 open positions. In fact, that's most of what I find is 30 or more open recs per recruiter. And some of those are going to be hard to fill, and some of those are going to be just, you post and you field applicants, and there's a lot of them, and you're going to process the applicants. So if you don't know how to hunt, and you've only been trained for how to deal with applicants, and every tool in your toolkit is about how am I going to get more applicants, then of course the 5 or 10 open positions you've got that are hard to fill will just drag on unfilled for month after month after month after month. And those have a massive impact on the financial performance of the company. If there's a team that's particularly short staffed, it might start erupting into more turnover on that team. These are the kind of things that create political pressure on chief HR officers and heads of talent acquisition. If they can't fix these kind of problems, then people start wondering about the quality of the leadership in the HR function. So quite often I get the call when the chief HR officer just got out of a meeting with the executive leadership team getting beat up about time to fill. Like time to fill is the big lion. It's the big thing that hurts chief HR officers more than anything else. People don't really care how much it costs as much as how much the vacancy impacts the team.
Yeah, I think that so links back to my view on talent acquisition is very much a pipeline approach. If
Mm-hmm.
you can develop a pipeline and hunt and find the right people before time, then you have that ability to, exactly you say, cut that time period to actually time to hire dramatically, because you've already got a lot of warm leads that are interested, that are open, and that are ready to come over to your organization or come and work for a particular person or particular manager, a particular leader, because that's what their goal or their objective is. But it
Mm-hmm.
does take time. It also takes a lot of investment in the recruitment function, fundamentally from an internal perspective, to go, right, we might not be recruiting right now, and this comes back to your point around reducing headcount within that team, but we need to make sure that we have enough warm leads that when we do start recruiting again, we don't take months to hire, or we don't have to recruit somebody to then recruit the team to come into it. And I was listening to another podcast earlier today, which was Harry Stebbings' 20 VC, and on it, the guest, and forgive me, I can't remember what his name is, but I'll put it in the notes. He said, actually, in his view, the recruitment function, the recruiter, is the most important part of any business, because they're the person that controls who comes into that business. Effectively, they're the person that controls the talent and the skills and the
Mm-hmm.
experience and the expertise and the knowledge that comes into that company. And so what I find really interesting with what you were saying there is actually, I don't think it's something that is massively, it's not thought of particularly well across various industries anyway, but it's
Mm-hmm.
also, I think, not a huge amount of emphasis is placed on it, and especially not on that talent acquisition pipeline approach, which
Right.
we're kind of talking about a lot there.
There is something I'll just add to your point there, which I think is right on, by the way. It Talent acquisition, and the reason why I'm so in love with talent acquisition as a function is because of the massive impact that it has on the health of an organization.
Yeah.
So I've always felt that a superior talent acquisition function could take a mediocre company and transform them into a high performing company in about a 5 year span, just by controlling the quality of the talent that comes in. Now, likewise, a mediocre talent acquisition function can make a high performing function into a mediocre one in the same time period. So it's a very, very strategic investment that executives need to support. But, keep in mind that I'm a talent acquisition guy and I have that perspective. And I think a lot of other functions feel the same about their function. So that's fine. But if you ask most HR people to rank in order of all the functions, which one is the most junior or entry level function, and which one should have the most senior, talented, accomplished people in it, talent acquisition is often viewed by HR professionals as the first rung on the HR ladder. You're going to come in, you're going to do a little tour of duty in talent acquisition, and we're going to take the best ones out, and they're going to become the HR business partners, or they're going to move out of TA as a specialty for a variety of reasons. And it's really hard to retain high quality talent acquisition professionals over the course of a long career because they get laid off because other things happen. Um, but if that's the view of talent acquisition, and yet high level of skill in TA can move the needle for the company in such a dramatic way, how is this the case? That should not be the case. I think there needs to be room for very, very highly accomplished and even highly paid talent acquisition professionals that are highly specialized and know what they're doing, and they are professionals.
And so, how do you think we should counter that then effectively, John? How do we mean to ensure that reputationally talent acquisition isn't the lowest rung of the ladder, as you so rightly put it,
Mm-hmm.
also that the leaders place enough emphasis on it, and some do. We're not obviously it's a big generalization there. Some
Mm-hmm.
very much so think it's an integral part, but equally a lot don't. So what do we need to do? What do those need to do who are in talent acquisition? What do they need to do to make sure that they fight for
Mm-hmm.
themselves effectively?
Sure. Well, I think a big thing is not to be so stovepiped. Don't be so stuck in your groove that you don't have the right integration with the HR business partner, with the compensation team, with other people, right? You have to understand that if you hire the wrong person, you are impacting the compensation team. If you make the wrong offer, of course, the comp team's the one that has to go clean that up. If you hire the wrong person, then the employee relations issues splash over to the HR business partner, the ER teams, and things like that. And so I think there needs to be a stronger integration across these functional stovepipes. So recruiting should have a view into onboarding, for example, and potentially be compensated based on the quality of hire.
Okay.
So some of their bonus could be impacted if they end up hiring the wrong people. There's different ways to measure quality of hire. You have to decide on what that metric's going to be and what you want to incent recruiters to actually do. But there can be more of a connectedness across HR. They just tend to be stovepiped way too much. Recruiters can have, for example, a lot of comp responsibility, but they need to be trained properly to handle that responsibility and know what happens downstream. Um, so that's my opinion, I guess, and I think a lot of HR sees recruiting as standing at a desk in front of a sign at a job fair. When I one of the times I went to work as the head of recruiting for a Fortune 500 company, I discovered after I got there that almost the entire talent acquisition team were cast offs from other HR functions. They were people who had failed in other parts of the organization. And instead of disciplining them out of the company or firing them outright, they just stuck them over in talent acquisition, thinking, well, a trained monkey can go to a job fair and talk about the company. And that's what recruiting is. And that's what it does.
Yeah.
There's a there's not a very sophisticated understanding of all the stuff that happens in recruiting and the impact that it has.
I find it fascinating because that's you look at it from a UK and European perspective, which obviously where I sit at the moment, and working across a lot of the US as we do as well as a firm. You see the differences between the two kind of organizations, and actually the readiness and willingness to utilize talent acquisition and recruitment in a lot more open way in from our side in the US perspective, actually. And actually, you kind of when you're saying that, it kind of it makes me think even we even further behind from a European perspective, because there are, again, this is a generalization, because there are some companies that do really place a lot of emphasis on that talent acquisition
Mm,
team and element, and it's such a huge integral part of it. And in my opinion, you can then see that longer term. You see people that are there for longer. You see them; they're happier.
mm,
Their objectives align in a closer fashion, and ultimately, you get them to be more successful as businesses. Whereas the flip side to that, and I've said this on podcasts before, but my first job offer um, was with a recruitment company, and it was
mm,
such a poor experience that I said no to it because why would I want to work for a company that made me feel and made the other applicants in that situation feel that bad? Because how are they then doing that to the candidates and the applicants that they're working with? And it just doesn't compute. And there's a reputation element to that, and that's where I think that bad,
yeah,
almost like a poor reputation from it comes through. But I
mm,
think what you're saying there is really, really kind of fascinating from that perspective because it is such a critical part of a
mm.
company's a company's success ultimately.
Yeah, I've actually wondered, and I'll wonder out loud here with you, Dan. If a uniting mission or vision statement, say for an HR team, starting at the chief HR officer to all of the functions, could be our mission in HR is to maximize the quality of the talent, the quality of the workforce across the function. So how would that vision be supported by compensation and benefits, for example?
Mm,
In talent acquisition, it's pretty obvious. Like, we're going to hire the best possible people we can find. We're going to try to make sure we know what good quality looks like. We're training the organization on how to select good quality. We're managing that process and ensuring it. Now, once you have them in the company, how do you retain and promote and do that? Who are you promoting? Are you promoting people who really have the potential to be in that job? Are they going to fit the job that they're going into as well as the job that they left behind? And so often you promote the people who are good at the job they're in, not knowing if they'll be good in the job they're going into. So talent management and learning and development obviously has a direct impact on talent quality. And that's where all of their efforts should be focused, or at least most of it. So comp and ben is not so obvious, but if you look at compensation structures, you can ask yourself, like, which compensation structures would appeal to the top performers here, and which ones appeal to the bottom performers? And quite often, compensation and benefits are designed to appeal to the fat part of the bell curve. Most people, the average person here, is going to like this.
mm,
And then you discover, well, maybe our comp structure is actually alienating top performers and luring low performers to stay because they get comfortable. They don't have to perform at a high level to get paid. Um, Succession planning, all the things that HR does could be wrapped around this mission of maximum. We're going to try to maximize the quality of the talent in teams, and it could even be organizational design could flow through that filter. There's a lot of ways to look at it. And so often there's no unifying principle across HR, which is why people they end up in these silos that are disconnected, and they're not talking about the same things or the same language, and they have no common purpose
mm.
other than to get the merit increase done on time on its cycle and evaluate the benefits and make sure we're saving money and
Yeah,
so on.
yeah. That's really taking that vision statement, let's say, and a comment that you made in your going back to the very beginning of the podcast, and a comment you made there around AI causing as many issues. I told you we come back to it. AI causing as many issues as it does, and applicant volumes. Let's dive into it. Taking that vision statement of getting the best people and keeping the best people in the business.
Mm.
How, from an applicant perspective, how do you see the best way for them to stand out in an age where AI is causing so much challenge on both sides of the fence for the candidate and for the organization that's hiring as well?
Yeah. So the question is, how do candidates stand out? We can go into a deeper hole on how AI is affecting the whole hiring process right now. It's a mess. I'll just
Yeah.
say that it is a mess. So I would say the best way to stand out is going to be through networking and being referred in. Of course, you need to have a strong resume or a CV. You need to be applying to the right positions. I tell my salary coach clients, if your phone is not ringing and you're applying for lots of jobs and your phone's not ringing, it's usually two or three different culprits. One is your resume needs work. The other is that you've applied to the wrong position. So often an applicant, what you've done in your career, but your resume doesn't actually highlight all that stuff in a very good way. So it's like, hey, I know I can do this job. How come the person reviewing my resume doesn't know I can do this job? It's because that skill that you need to do this job is buried somewhere on the 18th bullet on page 3 of your CV. And it's also possible that you're applying for jobs where you meet maybe 85% of the qualifications and you don't see the other 15% as important. And so in an environment like we have right now, where we have way, way, way too many applicants per position, companies can be very insanely selective, and they are being that way. Um, so the third thing is that there's just too many applicants, and I mentioned that already. So the solution when you're in this talent buyers market, I think, is networking and referral. You need to apply still, but go around the application process, find another way into the company, discover somebody that you have an affinity with. Maybe you used to work with that person, you both used to work for the same company, you both went to the same school. Strike up a conversation with them, ask them how they like working there. And if they really like it, then you can say, well, I thought about applying there. I saw this position over there. Do you think I should apply? Oh, yes, I think you should apply. And some companies they'll actually pay employees to refer people in. So if you can ask a question, well, do you have an employee referral program that actually pays you? Oh, you do? Well, maybe I should send you my resume and you can hand carry it into the hiring manager's office. If it's somebody that knows you, like sometimes that moves you to the top of the stack. I can't tell you how many times that's happened to me as a recruiter working a requisition. I'll have the manager or the boss's boss or somebody connected to that position email me a candidate. They'll email me a resume and say, I want you to screen this person. And you know what? I'll look at that resume and it was like, if this was in the application stack, there's no way they would have got a call.
Yeah.
Because they know somebody, they're getting to take cuts in line. They can cut the queue to the front. And so often the person with a really bad resume actually turns out to be a really high quality person. But being a recruiter looking at a stack of 600 resumes, like I have no way of knowing, and I certainly don't have enough time to engage every person that applies.
Yeah. And I suppose that then leads on ultimately to the question around whether or not the current and traditional approach to hiring is broken anyway, because
Mm.
there are so many people that just ultimately it's not their skill set to put forward a particularly good CV, and then they put it into AI and it all goes wrong, and,
Yes.
and we know the danger of that. But equally, we've also got the flip side to that, where organizations are somewhat guilty sometimes of creating a bit of a unicorn job description. They want absolutely everything and they want nothing at the same time. They want
Mhm.
experience, but they don't. And so you then do have a lot of applicants applying because they think they can do the job, but actually, the important parts of that job description aren't really brought out as well as they could be. So I think it's a bit of both, but I still think fundamentally, unfortunately, I don't have the answer to this. Otherwise, I'd be a lot richer than I am, which is not very. And I think what we would be doing is, what is that that approach to hiring that takes it away from a traditional CV, that takes it away from talent acquisition manager looking through 600 CVs for one job. What is that kind of that golden idea? I don't know. I don't think it exists yet. Maybe it will do very soon. I don't know.
Yeah, yeah. It's my opinion. You remember when we first started this conversation, I talked about hunters and applicant processors. Um, part of the solution for dealing with that problem of the hard to fill positions just going unfilled is to divide up that workload, and you have people who are good at hunting take the hard to fill positions, and the people that are good and very efficient at processing, and you have them take those applicant heavy roles. But I'm writing an article right now with the Conference Board, which is like an HR think tank that talks. It's a futurist organization that thinks about what's going on now, what's going to happen in the future. And I'm writing this article with some other talent acquisition colleagues on what's the future of work in talent acquisition. It's my opinion that within the next couple of years, applicant processors will be replaced by AI. And that's a scary idea. Like there's a lot of improvement that has to happen in AI. But if you can imagine there are 600 or 800 applicants for a job, partially because AI is now applying on behalf of the applicants. You've got tools out there right now that are saying, we'll apply for 800 jobs for you while you're asleep tonight.
Mm.
And so that's why there's such an explosion. One of the reasons why, the other is the economy. But an AI can do potentially an intake meeting with a hiring manager and have a conversation with them about what's important, what should I be looking for, can then discern what interview or screening questions to ask, can engage with 800 applicants simultaneously. And that now is no longer a bottleneck. You don't get ignored. An AI could even hop into a meeting like this as a video avatar, schedule a conversation with somebody, ask the screening questions that a recruiter would ask in a phone screen, summarize the responses, rank and stack the performances of all 800 people to the hiring manager, and then they can look through and they can look at the top 5 or the top 15 or whatever they've got time for and decide. So I think that's probably the future, and it doesn't sound very good to most people. They don't like this idea of talking to a machine, or having people already hate the idea that an ATS is somehow evaluating their resume and ranking them for the recruiter. Imagine how that's going to go forward. But hard to fill positions, I think, are the future of talent acquisition on the corporate side for humans. I think if you're working in TA now and you don't have that skill, you should learn it, because hard to fill positions are always going to require that white glove outreach, human contact going forward. And I just think that's probably how we're going to get through this, is more reliance on AI to automate certain parts of that applicant heavy pool. Um, there are all kinds of risks, though. One of
Yeah.
which is you got to train that AI, and if you train it with your human bias, you're just going to multiply your bias problems, right?
Yeah. The bias issue is fundamentally it's been trained on bias already. You're training it even more on your own biases, and it just
Mhm.
exacerbates. So look, there are plenty of people much cleverer than I that are trying to fix that. But I completely
Mhm.
agree. What I think as well, though, just kind of building on your point. Sorry, is I think it's about seniority as much as it's about volume as well. So the hard to find positions will also that kind of expertise will also be the same for the more senior positions that you go up. So I
Mhm.
completely agree with you. I think
Yep. Yep.
um, AI will replace that almost middle management and below across the board, both from a external agency perspective and from an internal perspective.
Yeah,
And whether that's a
I
positive or negative, we won't go into now.
I feel like the change management is going to be a big issue. Kind of like long ago when ATMs came into the banking industry. Initially, every banking customer said, "There's no way I'm letting a robot handle my money." And I want to talk to a human. I want to talk to a teller. I want to go in and see somebody that's taking my check away from me or handing me cash. And that lasted for a while. And now today, there's an almost universal preference for online banking apps and for ATMs. And people go into the bank once a year or twice a year, maybe, in most cases. And a more current example is how grocery stores and other places have rolled out automated kiosks for checkout, ordering kiosks at restaurants, things like this. At first, people didn't like that idea. Now we've kind of grown accustomed to it. So I think it's a change management is going to be an issue in this case.
Yeah, it's fascinating, and I think we could dive down this rabbit hole for a lot longer. But I'm conscious of
Yeah.
your time, and before we get to the last question, I want to touch on your work with Salary Coach because I find it fascinating. Obviously, you've been on both sides of the table now in terms of negotiation from
Mhm.
an organization's perspective and negotiations from an individual's perspective. But again, in your experience from the very beginning of when you started negotiation from a organizational perspective and to now where you're on the other side, what differences have you, are the challenges the same? What differences have you seen? I mean, go into it a little bit because I find it fascinating.
Yeah, I think that negotiation changes quite a lot depending on how much power the candidate feels in the process. And so when you're in a weak jobs market like this, the fear of losing the offer is more than when you're in a strong jobs market. And so, I'd say though that the percentage of people that negotiate and the percentage of people who don't has stayed the same over the course of time, depending, regardless of the market. 80% of people don't negotiate at all. And 20%, the other 20%, about half of them negotiate well, and the other half negotiate so poorly that they cost themselves the offer or they damage a relationship on the way in and so on. So, as a built salary coach, what I try to do there is teach people that negotiation is not a high stakes game of chicken. It is not a win lose scenario. Um, a good pay negotiation should be a collaboration, and if you're doing it right, you can actually build the relationship on the way in instead of damaging it, like so many people are afraid of. And so the promise that I make to my clients is that you can maximize your offer while keeping the risk of losing the offer to almost zero if you follow that salary coach method that I've developed. There's a huge emphasis on keeping the risk to almost zero because that's why most people don't even start. Even if I told them what to do and what to say, if they thought there was a big chance they would lose the offer, they wouldn't follow the program. So safety and knowing what to say and how to say it at every single step is a huge part of what I've developed. And so far, it's been extremely successful.
I, I was surprised actually when you said the 80%
Mhm.
don't negotiate at all. Not as surprised that half of the 20% don't negotiate very well. That doesn't surprise me at all. Um, of the 20% or the 10% that negotiate well, is there a difference between the sexes or kind of what's is there any kind of gender differences, are there any race differences, etc.? Because we always see, and you mentioned it earlier actually, around kind of if you hit 85% of the marks on a job description,
Mhm.
then you go for it or not. And actually, research, loads of research behind the fact that women tend not to go for a job unless they hit 100%. Men can hit one and they'll go for a job, and it doesn't really
Correct.
matter.
Yeah.
Is that the same from a negotiation salary perspective, or how have you found it?
It is slightly different. So when I first started this business, my first 8 clients were men. And I actually wondered out loud if I was ever going to have a female client. And I was wondering if it was because maybe because I'm a man and they wanted to relate more to a female coach or something like this. Maybe they thought I wouldn't understand the uniqueness of their situation, or maybe they just didn't even think that that was a possibility. These were all the things that were running through my mind. Over the course of time, it's evened out, and now I actually have more female clients than male, just right now. But when I was writing Act Your Wage, I asked the question. Um, I interviewed about 100 senior level job seekers to write the book. And I asked them the question, who has the advantage in pay negotiations, men or women? And I got different answers from the men and from the women. This was kind of interesting, and I learned some things in the process. So during that process, I learned that men are much more concerned about losing the offer. So there's um, there's a lot of pride in men, I think, and pressure. If they get down to the finish line and their family, their friends, whatever, they know they're interviewing, and they have to go back to those people and say, I didn't get it. And there's a lot of people that rely financially too on that. Um, and women had that same concern, but they had an extra one. And that was women were way more concerned, even above losing the offer. They were worried about damaging relationships on the way in.
Okay.
And that was very interesting to me. None of the men said that they thought that was a risk. So the men were more or less concerned about damaging the relationships. Maybe they thought that's just a normal thing for me to be assertive. And I pressed into that a little bit. And you know that the research indicates that if a woman is being assertive, sometimes it's interpreted as being aggressive. There's a negative spin that gets put on that. I think women, especially senior level career women, are hyper aware of that risk. They've been told that, and they've probably experienced that.
Yeah.
And so because of this, they are much more conservative when it comes to pressing for the offer because they feel it will damage the relationship of the HR person or the future boss or somebody else. They don't want to do that, and so risk and what you stand to lose is perceived differently from men and women in general. I mean, this is a generalization, of course. My findings is talking to 100 senior level job seekers.
Yeah, I find it fascinating, and I think, um, I think the whole subject area is really interesting because I think I don't necessarily I can understand. Whilst I was surprised, I can actually understand why that number that don't negotiate is so high, and
Mm,
I think partly at more junior levels, obviously, it's slightly less relevant, but I think there should be an emphasis on organisations to be a little bit more transparent with where that
mm,
salary level is, because I think there's a lack of transparency in that department across the board at the
sure.
moment. But I also think at more senior levels, I think it's almost a marker of respect between the two. That if you're kind of going, right, well, actually, I think I'm worth X. I only have this much in the budget, and we need to kind of come to some form of agreement.
Yeah,
You then also get to a point where actually, you find out that you're getting paid less than they had in the budget, and all of this, and it just damages the relationship longer term on both fronts. So it's down to both the organisation and the candidate to really be open and transparent within that
agreed.
negotiation. But
Agreed.
obviously, it's a
Yeah,
negotiation at the end of the day.
when I first started thinking about this as a business, I long ago, back when I was working in corporate HR, recruiting, getting laid off, like I devised this way of preventing my layoff. It was a self-defense mechanism. So what I would do is I would pitch an offer, I would get it approved at a certain level, and then I would begin a negotiation somewhere below that. In other words, I would pre-approve negotiating room. I could start at this, I could go up to that. And if I closed lower than the top, I counted that as a savings that I was creating for the company. And I actually set a goal to save my annual compensation package every month in negotiation savings. And that's really when I became aware of how much money people were actually leaving on the table.
Yeah.
In some cases, it's 50, 60, $80,000. For a
Yeah.
senior person, it could be six figures. And the perception of risk pushes them so far away from negotiating that they would quite easily and quickly leave that just to do away with the uncertainty of the conversation. They're tired of the uncertainty, it's worn them out. And because of that, they just want to be done with it. And there's a person like me that's negotiating 5 or 6 offers a week on the other side of that phone. And my job is to get you to take the first offer. Like, that's what I get paid to do. And so I'm kind of like the prosecutor who has now become the defense attorney in the conversation. I've the best defense attorneys used to be prosecutors. They know all the rules. They know all the loopholes. They know when you've got leverage to get something, and that's what I do now, and I'm having an absolute blast doing that.
I can imagine. John, you've been more than generous with your time so far. So before we close off the podcast, and you've had a bit of time to prepare for this one, so we ask the same question to every single guest at the very end. So, what's 2 pieces of advice? What's the one piece of advice you give to those currently looking for a job, and what's the one piece of advice for those that are looking for the best talent for their organizations?
Okay. So if you are looking for a job, I'll give you 2 pieces of advice. First is learn to network and leverage your network in the search process. Second piece of advice I would give you is don't accept the offer immediately when it comes. You're going to be very tempted to do that because of the uncertainty, but you have tremendous power, the most power you ever have in the pay negotiation process is between when you get the offer and when you say yes. So if you get the offer and immediately say yes, you give up all the power, all the leverage you have to ask for something else, to ask for something more. So that's the bit. What was the other question? Somebody looking to hire somebody?
Yes, what's for those looking for the best talent for their organizations?
Um, the best talent, I think, what you should be doing there is reflecting on the best people you've ever worked with. And before you ever start the recruiting process, if you're going to hire somebody, imagine in your mind the 2 or 3 top people in that job that you've ever worked with, and then ask yourself, what do these people all have in common? And then do the opposite. What are the worst ones? What are the the 2 or 3 worst people in this job that you've ever encountered, and what do they have in common? And that by itself, that small exercise will inform or should inform the questions you ask during the interview process. So often people get hung up on the technical qualifications of the job. It requires this number of years of experience. You have to be able to code in this language, or you have to know this particular protocol. Well, yes, those are things that can always be trained, but what really frustrates you as a manager is probably none of that.
Hmm.
It's probably that they didn't show up on time, or that they were a very political animal, or they were toxic in some way, shape, or form. You don't want those people on your team. And likewise, the people that were the top of the top performers, they probably had some traits about them um, in common. Look for those, and I think your talent, your hiring will improve instantly if you can start imagining those and shape your interview process around finding whether they're person A or person B.
I really like that approach. I think it's a really fascinating way of a review process, which I don't think enough of us do on a lot of different things, and also just kind of reflecting back as well on the first part of that answer. You're not the first person to say that networking is the most critical thing in the world. So hopefully that is starting to get through and start to kind of chip away at everyone's psyche. But look, John, really appreciate you taking the time to come on the podcast. I think this has been a really fascinating chat, and I think again, I say this a lot, but I think there's a lot of really actionable insights that can come from this. And I think your experience on both sides of the fence is going to be invaluable. So thank you very much for coming on the podcast. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I appreciate it.
Thanks, John. And there you have it, another really interesting episode with John there. And I think some really interesting points to take home for both those that are hiring, but also those that are looking for jobs from an absolute expert in the field of hiring, talent acquisition and recruitment. His book, Act Your Wage, I will put a link to that in the show notes. And for those who are interested as well, the podcast that I was referencing was Harry Stebbings' 20 VC, and this particular one was with Ardash Hiremath, who is the co-founder and CTO at Merkle. So I highly recommend you check out Harry's podcast, but also check out that one. That was really interesting from a hiring and recruitment perspective as well. So I hope you enjoyed that. If you've got any comments or questions, please do let me know. And if you like, share, subscribe, pass it on to anyone you think might be interested. Help grow the show. That would be very much appreciated. Some really good ones still in the pipeline. So looking forward to seeing you in a couple of weeks' time.